So in this last section, we're going to look at the range limitations depending on the settings and the PicoScope model variants. So the vertical range is the first thing we're going to look at, and we're going to look at it from a ×1 and ×10 probe perspective. So if we go into our PicoScope here, what we've got is 1 kilohertz coming in, 1 volt peak to peak as normal with a 0 offset. So here we have our signal here. Now the probes in all our experiments have been set to ×10. So the probe setting is here. So we can now see that is on ×10 as before. And if we now look at the range available to us, we've got plus or minus 200 millivolts, which is this range here, through to plus or minus 200 volts. And so you have to make sure that you're actually, for the signals that you're using, you've actually got your system set up. So if you're using very high voltage signals, then you want to be making sure that you've got your probe on ×10 and you don't overdrive the inputs to your test equipment. So what happens when you change the probe from ×10 to ×1? Well, let's have a look and see what happens. So what I'm going to do here is let me just show you what I'm actually doing. So here's my probe here, and this is my switch on the side, and I'm going to change this to ×1. So I've just switched that switch. Let me just go back to my screen, and now you'll see it's gone over range because it's now in the wrong scaling. So I'm going to go to the probes, go to ×1, and then go to the vertical. Now what you'll see now is this range has changed. So no longer does it go from plus or minus 200 millivolts to plus or minus 200 volts. Because it's on ×1, it now will only let you go from plus or minus 20 millivolts to plus or minus 20 millivolts to plus or minus 20 volts. So this is the vertical range limitation now, depending on the switch settings you've got on your scope probe. Now, what happens from a time-based perspective? So let me just go to the presentation here. So if we look at it from a time-based perspective, it does depend on the model variant that you're actually using. Now, if we go to the time base on this scope, now remember we are using the 2208B, and that's a 100 megahertz bandwidth scope. And you'll notice it will go all the way up to 1 nanosecond per division. However, if I change the model, then this will change here as well. So although we're demonstrating here primarily the 2206, you may not be able to, depending on your model, you may not be able to get the 1 nanosecond range up here. So let's see what happens when you change our scope. So what I'm going to do is shut this, the PicoScope software down. So I'm going to close that. And I'm now going to swap my screen over. And here's my original 2208B. And what I'm going to now do is put the 2204 in, which is this one here, and this is the one my students use at university. I'm now going to swap this over and go to the app and open up the app. Now, because I swapped the scope over, the PicoScope, when the software starts up, does actually find out what the device is. Once it starts up, you'll see it will eventually find the device, the correct device, and there it goes, 2204A. It's found that and it's set this up. And now, when we open all up, all the defaults, remember when it starts up, the defaults are for scope probes as ×1 and all that kind of stuff. So you've got to reset all of this if you're changing your model. But what's more important in this particular exercise is looking at the time base. And if we look at the time base now, you'll see that this time base now only goes up to 100 nanoseconds per division. Now this scope, the 2204A, is actually only a 10 megahertz bandwidth scope. So it doesn't need to be, or it can't go up into this higher frequencies. And so it's limited at this 100 nanoseconds per division. And so depending on the model you get these limitations for it. And there's just to accept that, you know, when you're buying a high performance scope, then you're paying more money, and therefore you have the facility to actually sample at a much higher rate and therefore look at signals, investigate signals which are a much higher frequency. And that's where the money goes into scopes, is actually monitoring that kind of thing. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure that you realize there were limitations depending on the model and also the settings on your scope probe. And so let's just go back here, and that's it for this video.